Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusek, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. The meaning and socio-political implementation of the term multiculturalism has become a flashpoint throughout the West. Supporters of multiculturalism argue that societies that embrace diverse norms and values are not only more dynamic and vibrant, they are also more just, and in fact represent the ideal form of the modern democratic state. Critics of multiculturalism, on the other hand, argue that permitting, or even worse, deliberately engineering a society that embraces different and even contradictory norms and values is not only incoherent, it undermines the very foundation of a stable civic order. What can Catholicism contribute to this often rancorous debate, one that has very real-world consequences? As it turns out, a lot. The Catholic Church has been around for over 2,000 years and has 1.4 billion adherents spread across every country in the world. Catholics speak thousands of different languages, dress in dramatically different styles, and have radically diverse patterns of life. And yet, amidst all this diversity, the Church remains theologically, morally, and institutionally unified. What makes this diversity in unity and unity in diversity possible, and what lessons does it have for the wider world? Here to help address this question and explore its implications for the challenges and promises of multiculturalism is Bishop Robert Barron. So welcome back to the studio, Bishop.
Thanks, Matt.
Today we're talking about multiculturalism as a kind of challenge, but also as something that has some promises as well, and how Catholicism can help us think through all those issues. But before we begin, what have you been up to lately?
Well, as we record these words, it's confirmation season. So a lot of bishops in the spring, we do confirmations. In my diocese, it means a lot of traveling because mine is a very long, narrow diocese from Wisconsin to South Dakota. So I can travel 2 hours, 2.5 hours to get to a confirmation. But, I like confirmations, and it's a joy to get around the big diocese, east to west, north to south. I do almost all my own driving here. In California, I had a marvelous deacon that kind of drove me around, but here I do my own driving. But it's a busy, intense sort of time. After a while, you get sick of your own homily. So we bishops, we tend to shake them up a little bit. Like I've got bits and pieces of homilies that I use, or I might just draw on the kids' saints' names, and I'll preach on that. But it's a joy, the confirmation season.
That's beautiful. Well, let's now turn to the topic of multiculturalism. As usual, let's start with defining terms. So at a high level of generality, how should we define culture? What defines a culture as a culture?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing, isn't it? It's been defined in different ways. I'd say something like it's that set of behaviors, practices, symbols, rituals, assumptions by which a people or community defines itself. Might be the culture, right? So it's a whole farrago of things, but often unexamined, assumptions we make about the nature of reality, symbols we use to express it, rituals we use to embody it, behaviors that typify it. All of that contributes to what we call culture.
So wrapped up in the definition of culture is the question, I know you've heard this term, of cultural appropriation, which if we pose it as a moral issue, says something like this, that it's wrong for one culture to take something that belongs to another culture. But Bishop, does this sort of conception of culture appropriate, I can already see where this is going, does it contain an accurate understanding of the nature of culture itself?
No. And, as everyone knows, I hate wokeism. And one of the things I hate most about wokeism is this very stupid idea. Look, there is a form of like deep disrespect to a culture. Let's take as a gross example of like a minstrel show in our American cultural context where, one culture kind of mocks another by taking elements from it and so on. Sure, there can be that sort of mocking, aggressive, and that's always a bad thing, obviously. But see, culture, as you defined it there, first of all, cultures do that all the time, and I have no reason to think that that's in itself a bad thing. Look, what comes to my mind, I'm a rock and roll fan. I was formed, I like other types of music too, but I was formed as a rock and roll person. That's what I like the most. Well, what's rock and roll? It's the version I experienced growing up with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and everybody else were a lot of white people from our culture and across the pond too, who appropriated music that came up largely out of the black community. Think of jazz music, think of blues, rhythm and blues, think of gospel. All these forms that kind of came together to produce what we call rock and roll. I love the fact that these two English kids meet each other on this London subway, and one of them drops this record, and it's this Chuck Berry record. And the other goes, "Hey, Chuck Berry, I love Chuck Berry."
Yeah.
Well, that was Mick Jagger and Keith Richards.
Right.
And they formed the Rolling Stones, who then basically they're a blues band. They popularized the music of Muddy Waters and so on. There's a great, you find that on YouTube, of it's at this club in Chicago that Muddy Waters often played at. And the Stones were touring, and they were in Chicago. And so Richards and Jagger go to this club, this little club, and they're in the audience, But then Muddy Waters, the greatest of the bluesmen, call them up on the stage. And then these two, they were young at the time, these young, white kids are playing with the great Muddy Waters. I love it. What's the matter with that? To me, that's a beautiful thing. Elvis, we'd have to get rid of Elvis if we say any move in that direction is cultural appropriation. Here's another thing with rock and roll in mind. Just, I don't know, a month or so ago, I'm on one of these long flights. And in the long list of movies, there was the Blues Brothers movie. Well, I saw it years ago, and I'm a Chicagoan, so I put it on. And of course, it's so goofily entertaining movie. But here are these two very, very modestly talented white guys, Aykroyd and Belushi, right?
Yeah.
But what they do, I mean, neither one could sing, and Aykroyd could make a few noises on the harmonica. That was it, right? They had no talent, really. But they showcased the greatest architects of contemporary music, Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles, and there was James Brown, and you had John Lee Hooker. I mean, these great figures. Well, you could say, oh no, cultural appropriation. How dare those, talentless white guys? Or how about, no, they provided a platform. They kind of surrendered their own identity to allow this cultural expression to happen. I don't see the problem with that. And I think the danger, and this is why I hate it, the danger of this cultural appropriation language is it'll lock us into a neo-segregationism, right?
Absolutely.
The great civil rights people fought segregation. They were right to do so because it was so unjust. But what we're tending toward now in these weird corners of wokeism is, let's have a graduation for the black kids and then another for the white kids. Let's have a dorm for the black kids and one for the white kids. Only black people should play, blues and rhythm and blues. I mean, give me a break.
Right.
Cultures, first of all, don't work that way. Try to do that. Try to limit them that way. It won't work. But secondly, it's deeply offensive to me morally. It's a neo-segregationism, maybe animated by a concern for justice, okay, but man, taking a really ugly expression.
It seems it also just denies sociological reality that you can't, any culture you would look at and isolate, you're going to find countless strands of other cultures.
Of course, right. They're always, absorbing and reabsorbing and reconsidering and taking in, and that's life. That's life, and we shouldn't try to corral it in this segregationist way.
Amen. So given this definition of culture that you've just laid out, how then should we define multiculturalism?
Yeah, and of course that depends. That there are different cultures, of course. I mean, anyone will notice that they exist increasingly because of globalization. All that they exist side by side, or they're mixing and mingling. Yeah, for sure. And so, as a sociological observation, of course, there's multiculturalism. But then there are more ideologically driven readings of that term that are more problematic. I think our country, speaking as an American, that was a major, major issue in the founding fathers of our country, is they were dealing with their own version, if you want, of multiculturalism. Mm-hmm. Not as radical as the ones we're talking about now, but, how to handle different religious points of view and different backgrounds and people coming from different countries. And that's been an age-old issue for Americans. So, all right, and we're a multicultural country. Terrific. But I think you're suggesting a more ideological way to read that's more problematic.
Oh, we'll get into that in more detail.
Okay.
So multiculturalism is not only an abstract idea that leads to theoretical debate, it's also a reality that many contemporary societies, especially within the West, are grappling with as a challenge, a socio-political challenge.
Yeah.
So before we look at some Catholic resources for understanding and constructively addressing those challenges, let's look at some secular, philosophical, and political approaches to them. to the challenge of multiculturalism. So the first approach, again, this is from a secular perspective, is to affirm that all cultures are morally equal and therefore deserve equal moral and political recognition and representation in society. How would you evaluate that solution?
No, it's bad because it doesn't really provide a moral criterion at all. It just is an abstract assertion that all cultures are equally valid. Look, cultures are a mixed bag. They're always good and bad. The same culture at really the same time that produced Shakespeare produced slave traders.
Right.
Okay, so English culture, 17th century, boy, was it great. No, it sure was great in the measure that it produced Shakespeare. It sure was awful in the measure that it produced slave traders. So it goes with every culture. What if you were to say you're a German in 1935 and you say, I'm a theologian reaching out to the culture and I want to just really affirm the culture? I mean, come on. Or you're an American circa 1950 and you're operating in the Deep South. You say, my goal here is to, valorize the culture and not to come out against it. Come on. Cultures are good and bad. Mm-hmm. And we've got to find some kind of criterion by which we make that determination. I remember years ago when I was teaching at the seminary, we had like Multicultural Week. And we have, liturgies with different cultures and all that. And one of the things we had was on the main level, there were display tables. And we had kids from all over the world. There was African, Asian, Latin American. And people would put symbols and elements and beautiful things from their culture on the tables. Great, beautiful. I remember one time that I said to somebody, but what we should all do too, including our own culture, is put the ugly things from our culture on a table.
Yeah.
So we have all this wonderful stuff, and we got some really questionable stuff in our set of symbols, assumptions, practices, and behaviors, right? To be fairly multicultural, say both those things. There's a kind of moral indifferentism that can take over when we say, like, everyone's great, all cultures should be respected. No, all cultures should be evaluated. Now, I say as a Christian, in light of Christ. In light of Christ, read every culture, good and bad.
Mm-hmm. Pope Benedict XVI called this option that we're examining right now a dictatorship of relativism.
Right.
What do you think? What is he getting at?
Yeah, one of his famous phrases that the relativistic view, which is there's no absolute norm, no absolute truth or moral criterion. It's just, you got yours, I got mine. My culture's good, your culture's good, let's tolerate each other. That when that becomes the dictated ideology, we got problems, And I think he was dead right about that, naming that as a problem in our Western cultures now. That's another ugly side of wokeism.
So the second secular approach to the question or problem of multiculturalism is to affirm that the dominant culture within any given society, so the culture that represents the most number of people in the society numerically, that culture should be given moral and political recognition at a higher level precisely because it represents the majority. What's your take on that?
Oh, God help us. Germany, 1935. If you were to say that, the majority culture is right. But it's interesting, Matt, because we're a democratic republic. We honor democracy as a political sort of means, right, to an end. But it's how wonderful that we had the Bill of Rights and that they recognized early on what Tocqueville saw too, that there can be a dictatorship of the majority. There can be a dominance of the majority. And so we have to have certain things that are guaranteed, that are not a matter of majority vote. That's just our freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and of religion, et cetera. That's not a matter of, let's say you could gather the 57% of this country think that there shouldn't be freedom of religion. Well, okay. No, the Bill of Rights says that's not okay. Mm-hmm. There are certain moral norms that are not subject to democratic adjudication. So that's the danger of that approach. It sounds very benign, like, oh, sure, why don't we just go with the majority? Heck, the majority can be deeply dysfunctional. Again, go back to 1857 in our country, both North and South, I would say. You probably could muster a strong majority that would think, no, the slave economy, let's keep it where it is. Mm-hmm. Certainly in the South, you'd find a huge majority in favor of that. Does that make it right? You've got to have some kind of moral mooring, or else you are just caught in the sea of relativism.
So the third approach is the obverse of that second approach, namely that the minority or minority cultures, they deserve more moral and political recognition. because they do not represent the majority.
Yeah, and that's the one that dominates today,
Yeah.
I'd say. And that's another ugly side of wokeism because, what's admirable about that, let's just be upfront about it, is, when you read the world in terms of power relationships, are certain groups or cultures or individuals in relatively powerful positions, others relatively powerless? Sure. And there's a variety of reasons for that, right? But is it therefore an admirable instinct to say, well, let's, try to raise up those who have been oppressed over the... Sure, I have no problem with that. But the trouble is, like in wokeism, it's because of Michel Foucault, is we read all of reality through the exclusive lens of the powerful and powerless, the oppressor and oppressed. In that schema, let's say you're white, a Christian, Western, what else can we say, maybe heterosexual, you are massively on the side of the powerful. If you're a person of color, you're non-Christian, you're gay or whatever, now you're massively, was intersectionality, you're massively on the side of the oppressed. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you're good, they're bad. A culture that's more of this stuff, that's bad. Culture more of that's good. But that's stupid, that when we use that's like using a hammer to do delicate work, you're using such simplistic categories. But that comes out of Foucault, and then before Foucault, others you could name, that wanted to read the world through that one, I think, very awkward lens. You got to read the world through a subtle moral lens, seems to me. Mm-hmm. I always think of that line from Man for All Seasons about, when Woolsey says to Moore, if you just looked at things straight on without that moral squint. Well, see, the moral squint, that's the right way to do it. Read every culture, oppressor and oppressed, with a moral lens, not simply through the lens of who's got power, who doesn't.
Yeah, right. And part of it seems to be kind of a non sequitur as well, because you take sociological categories, empirical categories, and then you impose a moral hierarchy on them.
Yes, quite right.
And it's not clear how one is connected to the other.
Years ago, it was in my training, that became so clear to me, and it's been like a guiding star for my thinking, is, yes, but is it right?
Yeah.
That's the question. Mm-hmm. So there's all kinds of questions you can ask. You can analyze things. Who's got power, who doesn't? Who's been favored, who's not favored? Who's white, who's dark? Yeah, but is it right? That's the only question that finally matters, right? And see, but we avoid that question like the plague, because it's a dangerous question. It's a dangerous question because it puts us under the microscope too, right. But is it right? And you've got to have a set of criteria to determine that question.
So before turning to how Catholicism can provide a more constructive way of addressing the challenges of multiculturalism than these three secular options we just went through, let's take a look from a Catholic perspective of how the multiplicity of cultures can be conceived not only as a challenge or a problem to address, but also good to embrace. Yeah. So, Bishop, given that Jesus Christ directly expresses his desire that we should all be one analogously, like he and God the Father are one, how can we understand the cultural diversity of humanity as something that's good and also willed by God?
Go to the Pentecost story, of everyone speaking these distinct language, but they all heard and understood them. The individual languages weren't suppressed. They didn't all become one language. That's the Tower of Babel, is let's all do one thing under one. That would be the oppressiveness of the one. And that's real. There I'll nod to the postmoderns and all that. There is a shadow side to unity, and it's totalitarianism. Mm-hmm. We saw it massively in the 20th century. It's still around today, too. The totalitarian temptation is like, we're all one. Think of like Maoist China when I was growing up, and everyone in the same outfit, everyone saying the same thing, everyone moving in lockstep. Paul Tillich, who escaped the Nazis, saw in the goose-stepping Nazi soldiers a symbol of that, of the one run amok. And indeed, remember the motto for the, Ein Volk, ein Führer, what was the other one? One. Yeah, one. Ein Reich, one, country, one government. No, the one and the many. Now, I would argue what we see today is the tyranny of the many. That's the dictatorship of relativism, where many, that's always good. Diversity, that's our, catchword today. That's always good. No. Diversity is good to a degree. It's good under certain circumstances, but diversity is also dangerous because what's the shadow side of diversity? Is complete vociferousness. That we've lost our cohesion.
Yeah.
We've lost what brings us together. There's no common purpose. There's no shared vision of the good life. See, so this hyper-valorization of the many, believe me, my generation, we got it in spades. The hyper-valorization. And the one-sidedly negative take on the one, the one-sidedly positive take on the many. I'll get Tillich again. It's unity and plurality in creative tension with each other.
Mm-hmm.
That's the answer.
Is there any analogy between the goodness of the diversity of cultures and the kind of diversity we see in the beginning of the book of Genesis and how creation's put together?
Yeah, sure. I mean, God doesn't make some uniform. There's not one emanation from God. There's this wild diversity, yeah, in the way things are created. And the enthusiasm with which they're named in Genesis always strikes me. All the particular things, and even those things that crawl upon the earth, they're all good, right? So that's the trick. The trouble, see, with ideologues on both sides is they'll one-sidedly resolve it. It's all about the one. That's the ein Volk, ein Reich. The other side is it's the hypervalorization of the many. The trick is, and you need political geniuses to pull this off, is read them together. Like when Jesus prays, Lord, they might be one, he clearly isn't praying that there be a Maoist uniformity. The church, as it's unfolded over space and time, I mean, has included extraordinary diversity. I loved that when I was in Rome for the synod on synodality, and there were 400 people. Man, they were from all over the planet, all over the place. Every color, every intellectual perspective, different cultures. Beautiful, beautiful. But please God, we were all under the aegis of Christ and about his mission and purpose. And it takes, again, kind of like a pastoral genius to know how to strike that balance.
Right. So notwithstanding these really positive elements of the diversity of cultures, it is the case, especially in our current context, both in the United States and internationally as well, that multiculturalism is an issue. It's a problem that needs some kind of political solution. So let's look at some Catholic resources to approach that problem. The first is the natural law.
Yeah.
So, Bishop, what insights does the natural law offer on how to address the question of multiculturalism?
Yeah, a lot. If there's a moral intelligibility written into the nature of things, which might be a way to characterize the natural law, and that human reason can discover this moral pattern, this moral intelligibility that determines right from wrong, good from bad. Aquinas would say there's certain basic principles of the natural law that are like the basic principles of the theoretical life. Like, for example, do good and avoid evil is like the principle of non-contradiction in the epistemic order. That's the version of it in the moral order. And then we can build on that, as Thomas does. Certain basic goods, to use the language of John Finnis. But those are all ways of talking about this moral intelligibility that can be read off of reality. I remember years ago, my intellectual hero, Monsignor Sokolowski at Catholic U, and this is years ago, but we were just starting to talk about diversity and aren't all things different? He said, yeah, things are very different. But he said, name me one culture that praises cowardice and denounces courage. Name one culture that praises irresponsibility and criticizes prudence. And he went through all of the, name one culture that thinks it's good to be unjust and that denigrates justice. He said, you won't find them because those virtues, which are grounded in the natural law, are universal. Thank God. C.S. Lewis called it the Tao, right? Using the Eastern symbol, but trying to express the same reality. There's a fundamental moral sensibility that is transcultural. And by that sensibility, cultures can and should be evaluated.
So that establishes a kind of foundation, a floor, a cohesiveness that's objective. How, within the same framework, can we then speak of diversity? How does that permit certain kinds of diversity?
All kinds of diversity. It's like there are 1,000 ways to play baseball, even though baseball remains baseball, right? And one of the beauties of baseball, when I was a kid, my idol was Roberto Clemente, who died, in a plane crash when he was about 30. He had just finished. He just got 3,000 hits. But there's something about the way Roberto Clemente played that was just beautiful to watch. It was a distinctive quality. You watch Babe Ruth swing now. There's these wonderful films they have of him, like in batting practice. Watch the great baseball players. They all played the game differently. They all had their own unique, accent. Watch Michael Jordan play. When I watched that series on the Bulls, The Last Dance, and I didn't know personally, but I followed Michael Jordan when I was a young guy in Chicago. And to watch him play again, I realized there's no one like him. There's no one like him. No one plays the way Michael Jordan does. Great. But by God, he was playing basketball just as LeBron James plays basketball and just as George Mikan played basketball. I'm really dating myself there. My father would have followed George Mikan. But see, my point is there's tremendous room for diversity within a basic structure. Or take aesthetic principles. Aquinas, the beautiful occurs at the intersection of integrity, wholeness, harmony, and radiance. Okay. Within that framework, man, you got every artist you can imagine, from Shakespeare to Bob Dylan. I mean, but they're all operating within the structure of the beautiful, but they're doing it each in a very distinctive way. Great. I don't want Maoist conformity, and that's a good example, actually, because remember, socialist realism, that was during the Soviet period, is the only approved artistic style. Hitler did the same thing. Hitler had an approved, Hermann Göring was in charge of it. He was in charge of the Luftwaffe and art, God help us. So that's the one taking over. No, there are a million expressions of the artistic, but within a basic framework of how you play the game.
Is it fair to say, so on the one hand, it seems you're making the case that unity and diversity are complementary.
Yeah.
But it also seems you're saying that unity is kind of like the condition for the possibility of diversity. So it's because we have the same rules that allows us to have this diversity of expression.
Right.
Intelligibly so.
And let's say, you're playing basketball and you're dribbling along and then, no, I'm going to pick up the ball. I'm just going to run with the ball. You said, well, I got to the basket quicker. Yeah, I know, man, but you're not playing basketball anymore. Yeah. And this is no fun. Or I'm playing football and I'm going to run out of bounds and I'm just going to keep going to the goal line. Yeah, but man, you're out of bounds. You're not playing football anymore. Hey, I got there quicker yeah, I know, but you're not playing football anymore. So that's where the rules are the great friend of creativity and of diversity and all that stuff. They allow, whether it's, Gale Sayers or Walter Payton, I kept dating myself, these old sports references. It's like old, Scotty McCarthy from the Boston Red Sox.
Babe Ruth,
yeah. I got to update my references. But it's the integrity of the game that makes that kind of beautiful diversity possible. That's the point. And the same is true in the moral order, right? See, the saints, look at the saints. They're really different from each other. There's not one way of being holy. Absolutely. There's a million ways of being holy. And God wants that. He wants me to be holy in a very distinct way. That's why he gave me whatever he's given me, right? And given me opportunities and so on. But yet there's a pattern to holiness. It looks like Christ, finally. That's the pattern of holiness. That's how it works.
So the second tool for constructively responding to multiculturalism is the Catholic conception of inculturation, especially with regards to the gospel, but not only that. So say a little bit more about what inculturation is.
Yeah, it's the planting of the gospel within a particular culture and then using elements of that culture as a legitimate bearer of the gospel truth. We've done it from the beginning. Paul on the Areopagus, right, is attempting enculturation, if you want. I've been walking around your city, and I find you're a very impressive people, and there's an altar to an unknown God. I want to tell you who that God is.
Yeah, right.
Paul is using elements of the culture and to bear the gospel. And there are a million examples of it, of how we've moved into a culture, not to destroy it, but to find what's beautiful in it, what we can use. I use the image a lot from Newman of we're like an animal making our way through the environment. You assimilate what you can, you resist what you must if you want to stay alive. So Christianity moves into a culture and certain elements of it are like, no, we can't do that. That's repugnant to who we are. Other things, yeah, we can adapt to that. Matteo Ricci in China, or Francis Xavier. Or the other side, think of the Spaniards and Portuguese coming over to the New World and discovering human sacrifice as a very common practice. All right, that's repugnant to Christianity. That has to go. That can't endure with what we're bringing you. All right. Other things can, right? So that's inculturation, is making that prudential and wise judgment of what you can and cannot assimilate.
So I'd like to end by looking at how the principles you've just laid out apply to our own work, Word on Fire, and evangelizing the culture.
Yeah.
But to draw to a point, the advice you've given, how can we apply these principles to the socio-political issues that so many countries are experiencing right now on the question of multiculturalism? What's some practical advice?
Well, I mean, use Christ as your criterion all the time, and make sure you have strong moral criteria as you do it. Don't be beguiled by what's being said in the popular culture, but have a clear sense of how you read reality morally, and then you move into the culture and you make, in a good way, judgments about it. You discern. I'll use that Pope Francis Ignatian language. Discern what's of the Holy Spirit in this culture. To evangelize cultures, I mean, you always evangelize people. A culture is an abstraction. You evangelize people, but you evangelize people that have an impact on this amalgam of symbols and rituals and practices that makes up a culture. You reach out to the university culture. You reach out to entertainment. You reach out to sports. You reach out to the political and judicial culture. That's how you do it. Assimilating what you can, resisting what you must, all the time announcing Christ. That's, I think, evangelizing the culture.
And finally, another sort of dictum we have here is that you cannot evangelize what you do not love.
Yeah, Cardinal George.
So how do we address when we enter into a culture, whether it's as evangelists or whether it's in the political participatory process, where we encounter something very unlovable?
Yeah.
How do we evangelize that?
Well, there are always unlovable elements in every culture. Cardinal George, and that's where I got that phrase from, that you can't evangelize a culture you don't love. He was a sharp critic of elements within the American culture, but he hated the term culture warrior. He hated that. He said, well, you shouldn't have an attitude of warfare against your culture. You have to go in an attitude of critique, but invitation, Now, he'd be the first to say, sometimes a culture has become so demonic that the only option is martyrdom, right? So you're a Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's not dialoguing with the Nazi culture. He went to undermine it, and it eventually killed him, right? Think of the early martyrs. That when the culture becomes so repugnant to Christianity, they gave their lives in witness to Christ. Okay, that happens. Remember, again, Cardinal George, I'm going to die on my bed. My successor will die in prison. His successor will die at the end of a rope. Now, he didn't mean that as a strict prediction, but it was a canny observation of what can happen as a culture goes into decline. I can tell you from talking to him at the dinner table, he did fear very much that our culture was on a trajectory toward severe decline and that it would turn hostile to the church. Now, do we see that? You bet. Not, thank God, to the point of martyrdom, but is the culture becoming hostile to Christianity? Absolutely. So you got to be canny. You got to have both eyes open, and you got to have your moral sensibility in place as you move through a culture. But you love it, meaning you will its good, right? That's what to love means. Right. You want its good. You want the culture to be built up in Christ. So you love it or you won't evangelize it.
So now turn to our listener question. Today we have Ramon asking for tips on how to evangelize young people.
Good morning, Bishop Barron. I am Ramon. I am from Malta. It may be pleasing for you to know that your Word on Fire ministry has reached even our shores on the other side of the Atlantic. My question is very simple. When it comes to young people, and I mean millennials and possibly younger, how does one go about catechizing that group of people, even if it's simply in a group of friends who are not normally very open to the faith?
Yeah, I appreciate that question a lot. And I was talking, in fact, yesterday, I was at one of our local high schools here talking to the kids who'd be Gen Z kids. So beyond there's the millennials Gen Z's after the millennials. Is that right? I get it mixed up. But anyway, these are really young kids. And I told them the studies have been kind of encouraging that the Gen Z people are showing a greater interest in the faith. I have a couple simple principles, and that's you do it with truth and you do it with beauty. You don't dumb down the faith. That's the tragedy of my generation is our teachers, God bless them, they were doing the best they could, but they dumbed it down. And that's a disaster because you grow up and a dumbed down faith won't sustain you. I think with young people, you respect them and you respect their intelligence. Again, I think of my nephew now working at SpaceX. When he was a high school kid, he's doing high-level calculus and all that. All right, why aren't we using high-level language to teach him theology too? All right, I won't get on that soapbox right now. But so don't dumb it down. Respect young people. And then present the beauty of the faith to them, and especially the moral beauty of the saints. Show the Christian life as not just a set of ideas, but an embodied way of life. So I'd say all those things, the true, the good, the beautiful, if you want. But don't dumb it down. Respect kids. Give them what's true and beautiful, and I think they'll respond.
Well, thanks so much, Ramon, for reaching out to us. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question in a future Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. We always love to hear from you. So many gems here, Bishop. We are at a close with our time. Thank you.
All right, well, look forward to next time. Thanks, man.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. See you next time.